2. Homo sapiens. The appearance of Homo sapiens is momentous. Here, at last, is recognizable humanity, however raw in form. Yet this evolutionary step is another abstraction. It is the end of the prologue and the beginning of the main drama, but we cannot usefully ask precisely when this happens. It is a process, not a point in time, and it is not a process occurring everywhere at the same rate. All we have to date it are a few physical relics of early humans of types recognizably modern or closely related to the modern. Some of them almost certainly overlapped by more than 100,000 years the continuing life of other hominins. Some may represent false starts and dead ends, for human evolution must have continued to be highly selective. Though much faster than in earlier times, this evolution is still very slow. We are dealing with something that took place over perhaps 200,000 years in which we do not know when our first true ancestor appeared, though the place was almost certainly Africa. It is not ever easy to pose the right questions, the physiological and technical and mental lines at which we leave. Homo erectus behind are matters of definition, and occurred during the many millennia that variants of that species and early specimens of Homo sapiens all lived on the Earth. The few early human fossils have provoked much argument. There is no doubt that men of a new type expanded into Eurasia in the warm period between two glacial eras from about 250,000 to 180,000 years ago, an age climatically so different from ours that elephants browsed in a semi-tropical Thames Valley and hippopotami swam in the Rhine. The Swanscombe skull, named after the place where it was found, shows its possessor to have had a big brain, about 1,300 cubic centimeters, but in other ways not much to resemble modern man. It is likely that he represents a breed of Homo heidelbergensis, named after the German city where remains were first found. These groups are descendants of some type of Homo erectus, and probably the ancestors of both the Neanderthals and ourselves, in their African forms. They spread fast throughout Africa and Eurasia, and reached levels of development not seen in earlier types of men. They were almost certainly the first species that learnt to kindle fire, with the momentous effects that had for humankind's further development. The next ice age then brings down the curtain. When it lifts, 130,000 or so years ago, in the next warm period, human remains again appear. There has been much argument about what they show, but it is indisputable that there has been a great step forward. At this point we are entering a period where there is a fairly dense, though broken record. Creatures we can now call humans lived in Europe just over 100,000 years ago. There are caves in the Dordogne area which were occupied on and off for some 50,000 years after that. The cultures of these peoples therefore survived a period of huge climatic change. The first traces of them belong to a warm interglacial period and the last run out in the middle of the last ice age. This is an impressive continuity to set against what must have been great variation in the animal population and vegetation near these sites. To survive so long, such cultures must have been very resourceful and adaptive. For all their essential similarity to ourselves, the peoples who created these cultures are still physiologically distinguishable from modern human beings. The first discovery of their remains was at Neanderthal in Germany. Because of this, humans of this type are usually called Neanderthals, and it was of a skull so curiously shaped that it was for a long time thought to be that of a modern idiot. Now we know infinitely more about these our evolutionary cousins. In 2010 scientists were able to map the genome of Neanderthals, based on genetic material from the remains of 3 ancient skeletons. We now know that Homo Neanderthalis, as the Neanderthal is scientifically classified, had its ultimate origin in an early expansion out of Africa of very early forms of humans, possibly 500,000 years ago. Across many intervening genetic stages, there emerged a population of pre-Neanderthals, from which, in turn, the extreme form evolved about 200,000 years ago whose striking remains were found in Europe. European Neanderthals, in other words, developed roughly in parallel with Homo sapiens, the species to which we belong. Other forms of early humans related to the Neanderthals spread into Asia, probably as far as China. Evidently, this was for a long time a highly successful species. The ancestors of Neanderthals and modern humans separated in Africa around 350,000 years ago. By then it is quite possible that some of their kind had already established themselves in Eurasia. 100,000 years ago, the artifacts of Neanderthal-type man had spread all over Eurasia and they show differences of technique and form. Neanderthals, like the different species which specialists refer to as anatomically modern, walked erect and had a big brain. They represent a great evolutionary stride and show a new mental sophistication we can still hardly grasp, let alone measure. One striking example is the use of technology to overcome environment. We know from the evidence of skin scrapers they used to dress skins and pelts that Neanderthals wore clothes, though none have survived. The oldest clothed body yet discovered, in Russia, has been dated to about 35,000 years ago. Even this important advance in the manipulation of environment, though, is nothing like so startling as the appearance in Neanderthal culture of formal burial. The act of burial itself is momentous for archaeology. Graves are of enormous importance because of the artifacts of ancient society they preserve. Yet the Neanderthal graves provide more than this. They may also contain the first evidence of ritual or ceremony. It is very difficult to control speculation, and some has outrun the evidence. Perhaps some early totemism explains the ring of horns within which a Neanderthal child was buried near Samarkand. Some have suggested, too, that careful burial may reflect a new concern for the individual, which was one result of the greater interdependence of the group in the renewed ice ages. This could have intensified the sense of loss when a member died and might also point to something more. A skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had lost his right arm years before his death has been found. He must have been very dependent on others, and was sustained by his group in spite of his handicap. It is tempting but more hazardous to suggest that ritualized burial implies some view of an afterlife. If true, though, this would testify to a huge power of abstraction in the hominins and the origins of one of the greatest and most enduring myths, that life is an illusion, that reality lies invisible elsewhere, that things are not what they seem. Without going so far, it is at least possible to agree that a momentous change is underway. Like the hints of rituals involving animals which Neanderthal caves also offer here and there, careful burial may mark a new attempt to dominate the environment. The human brain must already have been capable of discerning questions it wanted to answer and perhaps of providing answers in the shape of rituals. Slightly, tentatively, clumsily, however we describe it, and still in the shallows though it may be, the human mind is afloat. The greatest of all voyages of exploration has begun. Neanderthals of the later stages lived in developed groups. Not only did they care for the sick and bury their dead, they joined together in small bands, which coordinated effectively, hunted collectively, and had at least some form of communication with each other. By 100,000 years ago they had generated regional variations. Their DNA shows, for instance, that some groups living in Europe had developed lighter skins than others. In Central Eurasia, a new species had emerged, the Denisovans, who were genetically different from their Neanderthal ancestors. Neanderthal man also provides our first evidence of a terrible human institution, warfare. It may have been practiced in connection with cannibalism, which was directed apparently to the eating of the brains of victims. Analogy with later societies suggests that here again we have the start of some conceptualizing about a soul or spirit. Such acts are sometimes directed to acquiring the magical or spiritual power of the vanquished. In spite of their successes, the curtain started to come down on the Neanderthals around 60,000 years ago. After long and widespread domination, they were not in the end to be the inheritors of the earth. Climatic change may have played a role in their demise. So may the way they hunted. Neanderthals lived life dangerously. The big game they concentrated on may not have been very cost-effective. A lot of young Neanderthal skeletons are buried with deadly injuries from hunting mammoth. The need for whole family groups to hunt together in order to be successful may also have deprived them of the time needed for specialization and learning. And it is possible that at the end they were outcompeted in the battle for resources by their genetic cousins, emerging out of Africa, Homo sapiens, our species. We were to be successors to Neanderthals and to all other types of humans living around the world when our expansion out of Africa began some 60,000 years ago. But genetic research shows that we still carry with us traces of these other forms of human life. We know that Homo sapiens and humans of what we broadly call Neanderthal groups interbred. Up to 4% of our own DNA is of Neanderthal origin. But was such intermingling common also with other groups, whose identity we still cannot trace for certain? It will still take a bit of time before we can determine where and with what results different groups of humans interbred after our ancestors left Africa. This is one of the most exciting fields of prehistorical research and one that is going to have great consequences for our understanding of humans living today. After the Neanderthal genome was mapped, it became clear that some of the most important disease-fighting genes that humans now have originate from outside our own species. Some researchers think that the very fact that we could interbreed with other human groups contributed massively to the peopling of the Earth, because it provided the hybrid vigor that helped us become ubiquitous on all continents save Antarctica. Homo sapiens has been outstandingly successful, spreading all over Eurasia within 100,000 or so years of its first appearances in Africa. They are dated to about 160,000 BC, and eventually all over the world. But its origins are definitely African. We can now trace the male ancestry of every living man back to a common ancestor who lived in East Africa a little over 60,000 years ago. Its members are from the start anatomically identifiable modern humans, with smaller faces, a lighter skull and straighter limbs than the Neanderthals. At first a relatively small group entered the Levant and the Middle East, and mainly by following the coasts progressed to East and Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Australasia in about 50,000 BC. By then, they were beginning to colonize Europe, where they were to live for thousands of years beside the Neanderthals. In about 15,000 BC they crossed a land bridge across what was to be the Bering Strait to enter the Americas. Before groups of Homo sapiens left Africa, the species had gone through a very long development, longer, in fact, than the time it has now spent outside Africa. Over about 100,000 years mankind slowly developed the means that would propel us to become the dominant species. Not all of this happened as linear progress. Our ancestors were few in numbers and often lived a precarious existence, even compared to other human species that existed on the continent. One scholar has compared our development there with small candles flickering. Even if humans were already capable of transmitting learning, most of these attempts were snuffed out, with its tribe, through some cataclysmic event. It seems, however, that at some point, less than 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens in East Africa reached a critical threshold, in which accumulation of innovations and contact between groups became permanent. Some of this is probably linked to the development of language, which even in its most rudimentary forms facilitated learning and memory. About 65,000 years ago almost all of the means needed for expansion existed in Africa: complex tools, long-distance transport, ceremonies and rituals, nets, traps and fishing gear, cooking and huts. Some of these skills were undoubtedly picked up from interaction with genetically different groups of humans. There would be bottlenecks in later human development, both before and after the first groups left Africa, in which our population may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals. But some form of continuity would survive. Much remains speculative in assessing the reasons for the timing and pattern of the diffusion of Homo sapiens, and paleoanthropologists remain cautious about the fossil record. Some of them do not like to assert without qualification that we are all descendants from a small number of humans who left Africa roughly at the same time. Nevertheless, most agree that from about 50,000 years ago to the end of the last ice age in about 9000 BC we are at last considering plentiful and expanding evidence of men of modern type. This period is normally referred to as the Upper Paleolithic, a name derived from the Greek for old stones. It corresponds, roughly, to the more familiar term Stone Age, but, like other contributions to the chaotic terminology of prehistory, there are difficulties in using such words without careful qualification. To separate Upper and Lower Paleolithic is easy. the division represents the physical fact that the topmost layers of geological strata are the most recent and that therefore fossils and artifacts found among them are later than those found at lower levels. The Lower Paleolithic is therefore the designation of an age more ancient than the Upper. Almost all the artifacts which survive from the Paleolithic are made from stone, none is made from metal, whose appearance made it possible to follow a terminology used by the Roman poet Lucretius by labeling what comes after the Stone Age as the Bronze and Iron Ages. These are, of course, cultural and technological labels. Their great merit is that they direct attention to the activities of man. At one time tools and weapons are made of stone, then of bronze, then of iron. Nonetheless, these terms have disadvantages, too. The obvious one is that within the huge tracts of time in which stone artifacts provide the largest significant body of evidence, we are dealing for the most part with hominids. They had, in varying degree, some, but not all, human characteristics. Many stone tools were not made by men. Increasingly, too, the fact that this terminology originated in European archaeology created difficulties as more and more evidence accumulated about the rest of the world which did not really fit in. A final disadvantage is that it blurs important distinctions within periods even in Europe. The result has been its further refinement. Within the Stone Age, scholars have distinguished, in sequence, the Lower, Middle and Upper Paleolithic and then the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, the last of which blurs the division attributed by the older schemes to the coming of metallurgy. The period down to the end of the last ice age in Europe is also sometimes called the Old Stone Age, another complication, because here we have yet another principle of classification, simply that provided by chronology. Homo sapiens appears in Europe roughly at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. It is in Europe, too, that the largest quantity of skeletal remains has been found, and it was on this evidence that the distinction of the species was long based. For this period in Europe much has been done to classify and group in sequence cultures identified by their implements. The climate was not constant, though usually cold. There were important fluctuations, probably including the sharp onset of the coldest conditions for 1 million years somewhere about 20,000 years ago. Such climatic variations still exercised great determinative force on the evolution of society. It was perhaps 30,000 years ago that the climate changes began which later made it possible for human beings to enter the Americas, crossing from Asia by a link either provided by ice or by land left exposed because the ice caps contained so much of what is now seawater and the sea level was much lower. They moved southwards for thousands of years as they followed the game which had drawn them to the uninhabited continent. The Americas were from the start peopled by immigrants. But when the ice sheets retreated, huge transformations occurred to coasts, routes and food supplies. This was all as it had been for ages, but this time there was a crucial difference. Man was there. A new order of intelligence was available to use new and growing resources in order to cope with environmental change. The change to history, when conscious human action to control environment will increasingly be effective, is underway. This may seem a big claim in the light of the resources early men possessed, judging by their tool kits and weaponry. Yet they already represent a huge range of capacities if we compare them with their predecessors. The basic tools of Homo sapiens were stone, but they were made to serve many more precise purposes than earlier tools and were made in a different way, by striking flakes from a carefully prepared core. Their variety and elaboration are other signs of the growing acceleration of human evolution. New materials came into use in the Upper Paleolithic, too, as bone and antler were added to the wood and flint of earlier workshops and armories. These provided new possibilities of manufacture. The bone needle was a great step in the elaboration of clothing. Pressure flaking enabled some skilled workmen to carry the refinement of their flint blades to a point at which it seems non-utilitarian, so delicately thinned have they become. The first man-made material, a mixture of clay with powdered bone, also makes its appearance. Weapons are improved. The tendency, which can be seen towards the end of the Upper Paleolithic, for small flint implements to appear more frequently and for them to be more regularly geometrical suggests the making of more complex weapon points. In the same era come the invention and spread of the spear thrower, the bow and arrow, and the barbed harpoon, used first on mammals and later to catch fish. The last shows an extension of hunting, and therefore of resources, to water. Long before this, perhaps 600,000 years ago, hominins had gathered mollusks for food in China and doubtless elsewhere. With harpoons and perhaps more perishable implements such as nets and lines, new and richer aquatic sources of food, some created by the temperature changes of the last ice ages, could now be exploited, and this led to achievements in hunting, possibly connected with the growth of forests in post-glacial phases and with a new dependence on and knowledge of the movements of reindeer and wild cattle. It is tempting to see support of this in the most remarkable and mysterious evidence of all which has survived the men of the Upper Paleolithic, their art. It is the first of its kind of whose existence we can be sure. Earlier men or even man-like creatures may have scratched patterns in the mud, daubed their bodies, moved rhythmically in dance or spread flowers in patterns, but of such things we know nothing, because, of them, if they ever happened, nothing has survived. Some creature took the trouble to accumulate little hordes of red ochre some 40,000 to 60,000 years ago, but the purpose of doing so is unknown. It has been suggested that 2 indentations on a Neanderthal gravestone are the earliest surviving art, but the first plentiful and assured evidence comes in paintings on the walls of European caves. The first were made over 30,000 years ago, and their number swells dramatically until we find ourselves in the presence of a conscious art whose greatest technical and aesthetic achievements appear, without warning or forerunner, almost mature. They continue so for thousands of years until this art vanishes. Just as it has no ancestor, it leaves no descendant, though it seems to have employed many of the basic processes of the visual art still in use today. Its concentration in space and time must be grounds for suspicion that there is more to be discovered. Caves in Africa abound with prehistoric paintings and carvings dated as far back as 27,000 years ago, and were being added to well into the reign of England's Queen Victoria. In Australia there was cave painting at least 20,000 years ago. Paleolithic art is not, therefore, confined to Europe, but what has been discovered outside Europe has, so far, been studied much more intermittently. We do not yet know enough about the dating of cave paintings in other parts of the world, nor about the uniqueness of the conditions which led to the preservation in Europe of objects which may have had parallels elsewhere. Nor do we know what may have disappeared. There is a vast field of possibilities of what may have been produced in gesture, sound or perishable materials which cannot be explored. Nonetheless, the art of Western Europe in the Upper Paleolithic, all qualifications made, has a colossal and solid impressiveness which is unique. Recent finds confirm that forms of art were spread in different parts of Europe earlier than what has so far been believed. A remarkable figure of a large-breasted woman, almost certainly a fertility symbol, found in southeastern Germany in 2008, dates to almost 40,000 years ago. Other finds in southwestern France and northern Spain consist of small figures of stone, bone or, occasionally, clay, decorated objects, often tools and weapons, and the painted walls and roofs of caves. In these caves, and in the decoration of objects, there is an overwhelming preponderance of animal themes. The meaning of these designs, above all in the elaborate sequences of the cave paintings, has intrigued scholars. Obviously, many of the beasts so carefully observed were central to a hunting economy. At least in the French caves, too, it now seems highly probable that a conscious order exists in the sequences in which they are shown. But to go further in the argument is still very hard. Clearly, art in Upper Paleolithic times has to carry much of a burden later carried by writing, but what its messages mean is still obscure. It seems likely that the paintings were connected with religious or magical practice. African rock painting has been convincingly shown to be linked to magic and shamanism, and the selection of such remote and difficult corners of caves as those in which the European paintings have been traced is by itself strongly suggestive that some special rite was carried out when they were painted or gazed upon. Artificial light, of course, was needed in these dark corners. The origins of religion have been hinted at in Neanderthal burials and appear even more strongly in those of the Upper Paleolithic peoples, which are often elaborate. Here, in their art, is something where inferences are even harder to resist. Perhaps it provides the first surviving relics of organized religion. The birth, maturity and death of the earliest artistic achievement of mankind found in Europe occupies a very long period. Somewhere around 45,000 years ago appear decorated and colored objects, often of bone and ivory. Then, 4 or 5 millennia later, we reach the first figurative art. Soon after that we reach the peak of the prehistoric aesthetic achievement, the great painted and incised cave sanctuaries, as they have been called, with their processions of animals and mysterious repeated symbolic shapes. This high phase lasted about 5,000 years, a startlingly long time for the maintenance of so consistent a style and content. So long a period, almost as long as the whole history of civilization on this planet, illustrates the slowness with which tradition changed in ancient times and its imperviousness to outside influence. Perhaps it is an index, too, of the geographical isolation of prehistoric cultures. The last phase of this art that has been discerned takes the story down to about 9,000 BC. In it, the stag more and more replaces other animals as subject matter, no doubt thus reflecting the disappearance of the reindeer and the mammoth as the ice retreated, before a final burst of richly decorated tools and weapons brings Europe's first great artistic achievement to an end. The age which followed produced nothing approaching it in scale or quality. Its best surviving relics are a few decorated pebbles. 6,000 years were to pass before the next great art. We know little about the collapse of this great human achievement. The light is never more than dim in the Upper Paleolithic and the darkness closes in rapidly, which is to say, of course, over thousands of years. Nevertheless, the impression left by the violence of the contrast between what was before and what came after produces a sense of shock. So relatively sudden an extinction is a mystery. We have no precise dates or even precise sequences, nothing ended in one year or another. There was only a gradual closing down of artistic activity over a long time which seems in the end to have been absolute. Some scholars have blamed climate. Perhaps, they argue, the whole phenomenon of cave art was linked to efforts to influence the movements or abundance of the great game herds on which the hunting peoples relied. As the last ice age ebbed and each year the reindeer retreated a little, men sought new and magical techniques to manipulate them, but gradually as the ice sheets withdrew more and more, an environment to which they had successfully adapted disappeared. As it did, so did the hope of influencing nature. Homo sapiens was not powerless, far from it, he could adapt, and did, to a new challenge. But for a time one cultural impoverishment at least, the abandonment of his first art, was a consequence of adaptation. It is easy to see much that is fanciful in such speculation, but difficult to restrain excitement over such an astonishing achievement. People have spoken of the great cave sequences as cathedrals of the Paleolithic world, and such metaphors are justified if the level of achievement and the scale of the work undertaken is measured against what evidence we have of the earlier triumphs of man. With the first great art, the hominids are now left far behind and we have unequivocal evidence of the power of the human mind. Much else that is known of the Upper Paleolithic confirms the sense that the crucial genetic changes are behind and that evolution is now a mental and social phenomenon. The distribution of major racial divisions in the world which last down to early modern times appears already broadly fixed by the end of the Upper Paleolithic. Geographical and climatic divisions had produced specializations in skin pigment, hair characteristics, the shape of the skull and the bone structure of the face. In the earliest Chinese relics of Homo sapiens the Asian regional characteristics are discernible. All the main regional groups are established by 10,000 BC, broadly speaking in the areas they dominated until the Great Resettlements, which were one aspect of the rise of European civilization to world domination after AD 1500. The world was filling up during the Old Stone Age. Men at last penetrated the virgin continents, where none of their ancestors or relatives had been. Already around 50,000 years ago the first humans reached Australia, roughly at the same time as men of our kind settled in Europe. They were the descendants of people who had mainly followed the coasts from the Middle East, becoming skilled gatherers of protein-rich seafood in the process. It is now thought likely that they used boats to travel onwards to the new continent, Although the sea level in the Indonesian archipelago then would have been significantly lower than what it is today, opening up a world of land bridges and calm seas. After reaching Australia by island hopping through the Timor and Banda Seas, they spread out very quickly. The then lush landscape suited them. It had huge lakes and rivers, with a number of now extinct species that could be hunted for food, such as the giant wombat-like marsupial Zygomaturus, similar in size to a modern pygmy hippopotamus, and a 450-pound kangaroo, the Procoptodon. Human colonization of the last New World began much later. An Asian people, probably in several small but closely related groups, arrived in America by crossing a land bridge to Alaska from North Asia some 17,000 years ago. They brought with them tools and techniques developed in a region between the Altai Mountains and the Amur Valley in southern Siberia over the previous millennia. They then spread all over the Americas, first following the coasts and then, only slightly later, beginning to penetrate the interior. Some among the first Americans soon learnt how to build small boats. Others became experts at hunting mammoth and mastodon. The first finds of human habitation in Chile date back to 11,000 BC. Parts of the U.S. upper Midwest and possibly small areas of the Atlantic coast were populated roughly at the same time. Homo sapiens was already a venturesome fellow at the end of the last ice age, it seems. Only Antarctica among the continents was still awaiting his arrival and establishment, as it would wait until the year 1895 of our own era. Yet the Upper Paleolithic world was still a rather empty place. Calculations suggest that 20,000 humans lived in France in Neanderthal times. This becomes possibly 50,000 out of perhaps 10 million humans in the whole world 20 millennia ago. A human desert swarming with game is one scholar's description of it. They lived by hunting and gathering, and a lot of land was needed to support a family. Homo sapiens were exceptional hunter-gatherers when times were good. There is new evidence suggesting that the newcomers when first in Europe outbred the Neanderthals by a factor of 10 to 1. But even so, human population was small and the world very big. It is not hard to see that such population figures mean very slow cultural change. Greatly accelerated though man's progress in the Old Stone Age may be and much more versatile though he is becoming, he is still taking thousands of years to transmit his learning across the barriers of geography and social division. A man might, after all, live all his life without meeting anyone from another group or tribe, let alone another culture. The divisions which already existed between different groups of Homo sapiens open a historical era whose whole tendency was towards the cultural distinction, though in no way isolation, of one group from another, and this was to increase human diversity until reversed by technical and political forces in very recent times. About the groups in which Upper Paleolithic man lived there is still much unknown. What is clear is that they were both larger in size than in former times and also more settled. The earliest remains of buildings come from the hunters of the Upper Paleolithic who inhabited what are now the Czech and Slovak republics and southern Russia. In about 10,000 BC in parts of France some clusters of shelters seem to have contained anything from 400 to 600 people, but judging by the archaeological record, this was unusual. Something like the tribe probably existed, therefore, though about its organization and hierarchies it is virtually impossible to speak. All that is clear is that there was a continuing sexual specialization in the Old Stone Age as hunting grew more elaborate and its skills more demanding, while settlements provided new possibilities of vegetable gathering by women. Cloudy though its picture is, nonetheless, the Earth at the end of the Old Stone Age is in important respects one we can recognize. There were still to be geological changes. The English Channel was only to make its latest appearance in about 7000 BC, for example, but we have lived in a period of comparative topographical stability which has preserved the major shapes of the world of about 9000 BC. That world was by then firmly the world of Homo sapiens. The descendants of the primates who came out of the trees had, by the acquisition of their tool-making skills, by using natural materials to make shelters and by domesticating fire, by hunting and exploiting other animals, long achieved an important measure of independence from some of nature's rhythms. This transformation had brought them to a high enough level of social organization to undertake important cooperative works. Their needs had provoked economic differentiation between the sexes. Grappling with these and other material problems had led to the transmission of ideas by speech, to the invention of ritual practices and ideas which lie at the roots of religion, and, eventually, to a great art. It has even been argued that Upper Paleolithic man had a lunar calendar. Man as he leaves prehistory is already a conceptualizing creature, equipped with intellect, with the power to objectify and abstract. It is very difficult not to believe that it is this new strength which explains the last and greatest stride in prehistory, the invention of agriculture.